Welcome to Diving Deeper Discussions. My name is John Wood. I'm your host for this regular monthly series of conversations that's focused on an article or a book review that's published in the ASA journal, Perspectives on Science and Christian Faith. Today, we're drawing on a book review from last March, exploring the book, My Body, Their Baby, on a Christian Vision of Surrogacy. And the author, Grace Gow, and interestingly, the reviewer, Amy Patterson, are both with us today. This is a timely, insightful book, and I think we're going to have a great conversation. Grace, Amy, welcome.
Thanks, John.
Thank you, John.
So I've been looking forward to this. This is, as I think I mentioned earlier to you, this is personal in our family. So we have had this experience, and I'm sure it's personal in many families. There's nothing more important, I think, to certainly to parents and to grandparents like Kathy and I, than our children and our children's children. And when we think about this question of infertility and the challenges of birthing children, it becomes immediately personal and important to us all. So I want to thank you, Grace, for this book. It's just, I have found it just fascinating and personally quite helpful to think through the conversation. So looking forward to this today. But to start with, let's get to know you a bit. Grace, tell us, I know from having read the book, as many people will, tell us where you grew up, where you're from, and your educational journey, if you would.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that. So I am a second generation Taiwanese American. So that means my parents were immigrants from Taiwan. I was born in New York, but raised from about 3 years old up in Southern California. So
California kid.
Yes, I'm a longtime California resident, and I went up north for college at Stanford, and then East Coast at Harvard for grad school. First job at Virginia Tech. I was an ethicist there for 6 years. And the siren song of the grand return to California came when Claremont School of Theology was looking for an ethicist. So I returned in 2009 to Claremont School of Theology, which is my current institution.
Okay, and you're a professor of ethics there?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, very good, wonderful. So your faith journey, you grew up in did you grow up in a Christian family? Do you tell us a bit about that?
Yes. So the site of my Christian formation was also the site of my ethnic identity formation. So I grew up attending an immigrant Taiwanese American evangelical church. It's called Evangelical Formosan Church, and there are branches all across the U.S. And so I'm not entirely sure where this audience is in terms of, faith spectrum or whatever, but okay.
Just to tell you, it's a full spectrum. So ASA members come from virtually every Christian denomination.
Okay. So EFC is similar to like in terms of polity. It's very Presbyterian, although it's not officially either Presbyterian Church USA or Presbyterian Church of America, but just in terms of the polity and the organization.
Right.
And because we were Taiwanese, so for instance, our senior pastor was a woman. This is always very shocking for people to hear. I grew up attending this church as a young person in the 1980s, but our senior pastor was a woman. Now, that is coded in some places as progressive. Sure, it's progressive in some ways, but, as a church, there was not toleration for same-sex couples, that type of thing. So that is my formation. Yeah. And then at some point in my early 20s, I gravitated toward the Presbyterian Church USA because of its social witness policy. So I really liked what was coming out of the Washington office
Mm.
terms of gun control or race relations or
Mhm.
Israel Palestine, relationships or whatever. And so I joined a local Presbyterian
Okay.
church when I was working at Virginia Tech, Blacksburg Presbyterian Church. Actually, it's a long story. My husband was living in the district of DC. And so we were
Mhm.
members of an Episcopalian church there. So I was kind of like dual
Oh,
church membership.
yeah.
Yes. So that's
Oh,
a little bit of my journey.
that's great. Yeah, that's really helpful for all of us. Um, so I'm going to turn just briefly before we get into the meat of this thing to Amy and give Amy a chance to give us a little bit of a background on her. Amy, if I can get you to say hello there to
Yeah,
me and I'll catch you there.
I'm
Good.
here, John.
Okay, great. I've got the wrong view on here.
Okay.
Okay. Uh, yeah, Amy, tell us about your background as well, because you're at it's the Salvation Army Ethics Center
That's right.
in Winnipeg.
Yeah, so we're located in Winnipeg, but we're really a think tank for the whole of Canada.
Okay.
And what that means is that we provide resources that are that help people think ethically through problems that they face, both in ministry and in their personal Christian lives.
Okay.
So part of my role is that kind of resource development, but I also teach at Booth University College,
Hmm.
Tyndale University, which is in Ontario,
Hmm.
and I teach for the Salvation Army Seminary as well. So yeah, it's broad opportunities for me for these pieces. My personal interests in research include my doctoral degree was done in end of life care and Christian ethics, and since that time I've had to sort of spread out the sort of interest areas to things like gender and sexuality, social justice issues, human dignity, and because of a bout with brain cancer, I became deeply interested in suffering and compassion and how important it is as a faith community to suffer well with people who are suffering. So
Right.
that's where I've been publishing.
Fascinating. Fascinating. I'm just the connection between end of life care and beginning of life care is there's a symmetry there
Yeah.
that we don't see the full richness of, because often the conversations are captured into certain and really highly charged, emotionally charged conversations. And I'm thinking back to the 1970s, when I was coming out of my university training and uh, on my undergraduate work, and these issues came with the abortion issue, the Roe v. Wade in the United States, and all that stuff. And all of these issues come, but today we are having these rich conversations on end of care life and beginning of care life. So thank you for doing this review. We're going to hear more about that. And one thing, where did you do your undergraduate work?
Yeah, so I did my undergraduate work at Booth University College. So
Okay.
I grew up in the Salvation Army, a little bit like Grace. I grew up in what would be called an evangelical part of the Christian church.
Right.
Um, and so did my husband, but he wanted to become a minister for the United Church of Canada, which is
Oh,
far left of center in Canada. So I get to have a foot in both camps. It's a very
right.
interesting place to be.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this is fascinating. And folks, today you're going to hear both the Canadian and US, and frankly, the question of surrogacy and right to life, beginning of life, those questions are, I think, navigated quite differently in the US and Canada. We may hear about some of that, but let's get right to the topic now. And Grace, I want to bring you back in
Okay.
and and ask you, um, because I think I read it in your book. Tell us how you came to this. You're an ethicist, right? I understand that, but how do you come to this question of surrogacy? You tell us, maybe get us
So
started with that for just briefly.
Yeah, the origin of my interest is tied to personal experience.
Right.
So I ended up carrying my friend's baby
Hmm.
as their surrogate. And when I was visibly pregnant at the age of 40, and people naturally, there was a period of time where your pregnancy is kind of a secret, right? No one can
Right.
tell it. And there comes a time, unless you're actively disguising, it will be obvious to people. So
Sure.
at the time where it was obvious to people, so many people would congratulate me and say, "Oh, wow, I didn't know you wanted a third child. Do
Right.
you know what you're having?" And I'd say, "Yeah, it's a girl," but then I would add, "But, here's the thing, it's not mine, it's my friend's." And people would have all sorts of reactions
Yes.
to the fact that I was carrying my friend's baby,
Mhm.
ranging from compliments to
Mhm.
shock to concern to anxiety for me or whatever.
Mhm.
And I would answer their questions. And at
Mhm.
a certain point, enough people told me, you should write about this, right?
Mm.
Enough people said, you actually have the training. Like, how many people have PhDs in your field and are self identified feminists and have this personal
Yeah.
experience? And
Yes.
so it was through a combination of
Right.
thinking, I actually could write about this. That's the start to how I came to write about this, and then the book in particular.
Very good. Very good. And I would, if you haven't read the book, folks, you might want to go through, because Grace gives some background and further background and discussion of this personal story. And one of the wonderful things for me throughout the book was the way you interweave the academic and the personal. And you keep centering this back on us, families, couples, individuals, and you do that through the tool of your own life story, your willingness to disclose all of that. And I was thinking back to the first time I was introduced to this discussion. It would have been probably 1969 in a bioethics course
Mhm.
in my undergraduate days, and it was dry and boring and stilted and not very interesting at all. And this is so timely for us today. So thank you again for that. Well,
Thank
I think
you.
what we'll do now is we're going to turn to the audience. Otherwise, I have so many questions I want to ask you, but this is a conversation with our audience. So we're going to unmute the mics. And folks, the way this goes, if you haven't been with us before, you'll notice if you'll have the capacity to unmute yourself and ask a question. In order to keep this going, if you go down to the reactions button on the Zoom at the bottom, you will see a raised hand function, which I have just clicked, I think, on mine, and I'm going to lower my hand now. and it and that will pop you up on my screen, and I will be able to see your raised hand. I'm going to do gallery view so I can see all of you. So if you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand, and we'll address that question to Amy or Grace as we get going here. And so I've asked Grace that first question, but I want to turn and ask Amy now while we're waiting for people to raise their hands. Amy, how did you come to write this review? Did you pick the book, or did it pick you?
The book picked me. Actually, it was Chris here in the audience that contacted me about this book, and I was really happy to be given this opportunity because I just don't think there are enough reflections from Christian perspectives on surrogacy. Um, and I would echo what you say about the um, the strength that personal perspective brings to the topic, the added validity that this has because it is someone's story, and not just an individual's story, but a community's story as well, which Grace reflects well throughout the text, and how important it is for her to have not only the deep conversations with the intended parents, as you call them, but also the sacrifices that she made for the sake of a healthy child, and the sacrifices her family made for the sake of a healthy child and a healthy mother and wife. And you know, the kinds of pieces that she had to work out, all the complexities she had to work out with her job, and yeah, it's just a really well written book. And I think it, while it does come from you know, in her title, a progressive perspective, I think bringing that personal perspective into it, that narrative into it, helps it become more broadly appealing.
Very good. Yeah, I really agree with that. I'm thinking before we launch into the particulars of your recommendations, I want to explore this, what Amy just said there. I want to explore your background a bit more. You tell an interesting story about 2014 and having a conversation with a girlfriend, a gal that you knew who was struggling because, and then the next thing you take it forward to is a professional party or some kind of an event, right? We all go to those. And we're here at the event, we'll start talking, and you interject into the conversation something really interesting about surrogacy. And I think I'd like you to tell us a little about that. And the reason for that is the ASA is a professional association. The folks that are here are typically graduate students and postdocs and PhDs and career government industry academy, both Christian and secular academy. So that's the kind of audience that we are in both the social and the natural sciences. And with that, I think many of us experience the same kind of journey that you had in that conversation. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So, John, I think you're asking me to tell the origin about how I actually came to become a surrogate. So that's right. There are two key conversations. One is with a friend of mine, 2014, who I hadn't seen for 10 years. But I knew that she had breast cancer and had a double mastectomy. She was very public about this.
Oh.
What I hadn't known is in the interim, as a single woman, she had frozen her eggs in advance, thinking, you know, for fertility preservation. But at that point, she was a single woman, and she thought, so her planned path was maybe someday I would meet someone, fall in love, find a surrogate. But she lived in a country, I'll leave it omitted, where surrogacy was not allowed if commercialized. So it was just baffling to her. How would I ever find someone to do it out of the goodness of their heart?
Right.
And in talking to this one friend, I said, well, you know, it's not so much that I'm offering, but I don't think it's so crazy. You know, like I could totally imagine myself doing that.
Right.
So jump back to this other party. You know, John, it was actually a Super Bowl party. It wasn't even a professional thing, but I was talking with some of my professional colleagues at this Super Bowl party.
Got it.
And it was actually a member of my Christian small group. You know, you can picture this, a large party, and at a certain point you started to clump up in little more intimate groups. And the topic of conversation was, how did we know we were ready to have kids, and what did it take to have children? Because most of us pursued advanced degrees, and, you know, we were career oriented or ministry oriented. So everybody had a story to tell. But when it was my turn, I didn't really have a story to tell, because for reasons unbeknownst to us, I just never had fertility challenges. I could tell the story of when my husband and I were ready to have children, but I didn't have any fertility struggles like the other people did. So I anonymized my friend's story, you know, saying, oh, my friend, breast cancer, la, la, la. And in so many words, the intended mother, the person I ended up caring for, in a move that even shocked her. I mean, she could barely believe she was saying this. You know, it was one part jest and one part boldness. But she basically said in front of these other party goers, you know, if you were hypothetically willing to do it for your other friend, would you do it for us? And at that point, We did not know that surrogacy was even something they had thought about because they were currently on adoption waiting lists, but they just had not been picked. So
Yeah.
that is, and then we had all sorts of more intimate conversations, discernment, all the things. And then I ended up carrying their child.
Thank you, Grace, for that. And folks, the reason I've asked Grace to tell this story and to keep coming back to the personal narrative, I think is so important. It's sort of quintessential ASA. We have conversations with one another about the most difficult kinds of issues between science and theology. And this is an area, reproduction, beginning of life, end of life. These are the areas that are just fraught. And particularly so in the US right now and in the last few years. Um, Everyone in ASA knows I live in Canada, so I've been up here 35 years and looking back at my home country and down there and participating so much. And it's so difficult to watch this kind of polarizing narrative that becomes abstract, academic, or aggressively politicized or some way. And it's just fresh to have a personal story and just and the journey. Amy, as you said, right? It's a personal journey, and that's so important. One last thing about that is that as you're talking, I'm thinking about Kathy and I. We're on our way. We were she had just given birth to our second child, our daughter Katrina. And our friends in grad school, I'm in my PhD program at the time, which is don't do that. Don't have kids do a PhD at the same time. It's like, except my pastor said, if you don't do it, you'll never will. So these conversations are just exactly as you describe them, and we're coming back from this party for the couple. She's going to have her baby. Oh, pardon me. She's just had her baby 2 weeks before, and so we've all gathered to meet the new child and all. And she's only 6 weeks older than our daughter. We're driving back in the car, and Kathy looks at me and says, well, we asked Mary Beth if she was going back to work in 6 weeks at the bank. And she started crying because she doesn't have childcare, doesn't know what she's going to do. And Kathy said, I've been wondering if I should stay home with our second child and do childcare. That began a childcare service for the next 3 years in our home. That is a whole adventure in itself. 10 or 12 children, and you're deeply invested in the lives of these people walking through your door, bringing their children carefully to you and all of those challenges, and the neighbors bringing head lice along with them, which spread through everyone. And I'm an entomologist, folks, so imagine my daughter with long hair, she puts her hair up and I'm buttoning her dress for church. And I go, oh, I know what that is. You walk out to the back and put it under the microscope, which you have in your house. And you go, oh, yeah. And 2 weeks later, we got everybody cleaned up. But you realize that these are very personal and they come out of these stories. And what I'm trying to say long-windedly here is we need to share and have the courage to share more stories. So thank you. Chris, you've got your hand raised patiently. Please unmute and go ahead and ask questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Grace, for joining this group you know nothing about. We appreciate your risk-taking spirit in joining us. So a couple of things. First, just beginning with yourself, what were when you were first considering this as an ethicist, what were the kind of ethical issues that went through your head for yourself? And secondly, expanding beyond yourself to others, what are some of the ethical issues that you do see that get raised or that you continue to see with the issue? So can we take you into some of the ethical
Sure. Yeah.
patterns you're thinking?
So for me, when I was considering this, because this was going to be an altruistic case, this wasn't about payment. That's the big one beyond us. But for me, I would say it was interpersonal and familial. Like, will my parents be able to handle the fact that their daughter is doing such an unconventional thing? And then number two, will my children, will it psychologically impair them in any way? At that point, they were 6 and 8. And so I had to resolve how those two would feel. In the surrogacy literature, it's oftentimes the surrogate's partner, husband or boyfriend or whatever, that has some resistance. And as a best practice, you shouldn't do it if your partner is not on board, because as Amy referenced, there are sacrifices that the partner has to make as well. But unlike what's common in the literature, my husband, in fact, back to the friend who had breast cancer, when I told him the story of our conversation, he was like, yeah, absolutely. We should, she suffered so much. If you're willing to give this gift, we should help them. So that was, those were concerns on my end, and I was able to resolve them. The bigger concerns, society-wise, they have to do with payment first and foremost. There are concerns that payment leads to either commodification or exploitation or both. And so I talk about that in the book. There are long-standing concerns about psychological trauma to the surrogate upon relinquishment. In fact, when I was carrying this child for my friends, that was the most common question asked of me. Like, oh, wow, Grace, you're so nice, but aren't you afraid you're going to grow attached to this child? Or after I gave birth, and sometimes with my professional colleagues, maybe I only see them once a year, some of them, right? And so every so often, as the years would go by, some would ask, do you still see this child, right?
Yeah.
And the assumption in both cases, like if it's after the fact, it's that it must be so painful for you to be reminded, of this child you gave up. And so that's an ethical concern tied to just emotional or possible trauma. And that's something that I talk about in the book. That's actually the biggest misconception about surrogacy. And then there are, because with gestational surrogacy, you necessarily need IVF. And there are all sorts of questions about IVF, about the cost, about cryopreserved embryos languishing in tanks of liquid nitrogen, about the money, about hyperstimulation of ovaries for the women who donate their, so all sorts of issues. And John, you had referenced the changing landscape of abortion. There's also a changing landscape of IVF. And so I would say in the US, there are greater risks now to be a surrogate than when I was a surrogate, because abortion and fetal personhood laws vary state to state, right? And so the type of things that the type of autonomy that I had in 2016 is not necessarily shared across the entire US. So those are some other issues. And Chris, I'm happy to elaborate, but just kind of laying them out.
Yeah, thank you. That's helpful. John, can I just ask a follow-up?
Sure, do so, Chris.
Yeah, thanks. So Grace, I'm the father of 2 adopted children.
Okay.
So I know I have some familiarity with identity issues for children who are of non-typical origin stories.
Yes.
Let's say. So I'm just curious, do you know if surrogacy has been around long enough now? I'm wondering if there's any just social science work done yet on
yes.
On the site.
And in fact, the best social scientific work on surrogacy is following trends and comparing them, surrogate-born children with donor-conceived children and adoptive children. And so just as the adoption research is showing, the best outcomes for everyone is to disclose early and often, so it's never news. So they are saying that with surrogacy. But, with adoption, we have generations of research now, right? With surrogacy, we only have in the literature about, kids who are about 20, 25 or so. So we don't have the longevity yet. But what's interesting is, unlike children who are just donor conceived, in donor conception, oftentimes you can conceal. And historically, the desire has been to conceal because for all sorts of reasons, you want to protect the non-genetic parent, or you have shame about infertility, or, all sorts of reasons. With surrogacy, you usually have to explain, how do you have a child if there was no pregnancy, right? So usually people, now there are some cases where, in the case of a male-female couple, the intended mother fakes her entire pregnancy, with prosthetic bellies that expand. And, there are some extreme cases, but
Right.
more often than not, surrogacy becomes an open story, in the same way that in adoption, right? That there's been a movement away from closed adoption to open adoption, right? And you're seeing that also with donor conceived children, right? So I think, what is that? Ancestry DNA, those recreational DNA. I think one of them just became bankrupt or whatever, but now you pay $20 and all sorts of family secrets are coming out, right? And so this idea of taking your fertility secret to your death is no longer really viable.
Can't happen.
Yeah.
Great questions, Chris. Thank you for that. And Grace, I'll interject right here. You have principles in your later chapters, the last two
Yes.
chapters. You outline 7 different principles, and here this disclosure, no
Yes.
secrets, is one of those key principles that you outlined. Very helpful to have those in mind, and to see those. So, yeah, thanks, Chris. Keith, you want to ask your question?
Yeah. I was thinking that surrogacy is diverse. You can have
Yes.
donated eggs fertilized by the couple's sperm, or vice versa. You could have different types of surrogacy, and I was also thinking I'd have same-sex couples.
Yes.
You could have anyway, it seems like there's a spectrum there, and the kind of both the ethical and the emotional, personal aspects would vary across that spectrum.
Yes.
Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, in fact, that was one of the challenges of writing this book, was, because surrogacy is not one thing. There's the scientific split between the genetic or traditional, where the surrogate is both gestational and genetic mother, right? And then there's the IVF gestational surrogacy. So there's that. And then exactly how the triad comes to be. It could be a family relationship, a friendship. It could be we were perfect strangers and we met on the internet, right? It could be transnational. In some cases, it could be because one country prohibits surrogacy. So absolutely. And so what I do in the book is I start with a set of assumptions, almost like an ideal case, right? So we talk about, so it's not compensated. It's in state, so we're not violating any laws. And because I'm talking about a Christian framework, I say, and we're talking about a couple that's either married or covenantally partnered. And so for me, that means also same sex. And I have little footnotes here and there saying, I'm not talking about what the law should be. That's a separate question, the relationship between Christian morality and the law. I'm just talking about, for a Christian vision, we're going to stick with married or covenantally partnered. And again, little footnotes. We can talk about Christians raising children in communes, not in families, but that's another book, right? So anyway, I spell out all these assumptions, and then here's surrogacy, here are the principles. And then in my final chapter, I then say, well, what happens if you chip away at one of these assumptions? What if it's traditional, meaning it's the surrogate is also the genetic mother? What if it's interest across states, right? So a Canadian couple partnering with an American surrogate, or a Chinese couple partnering with an American surrogate, and what if it's commercial, right? And so yes, so Keith, absolutely. The other thing I'll add is that sometimes people assume that the commercial arrangement is necessarily there's going to be a greater potential for exploitation in the commercial arrangement, but that's not necessarily true. I think if you know anything about complex family dynamics, you know that sometimes, even if it's a relationship of love, there are people who can feel somewhat coerced, by either mother-in-law or sister or, brother, whatever, to carry so it is not necessarily the case that altruistic arrangements are smoother sailing. In fact, there could be unstated assumptions. There could be a type of blame, or So yes, absolutely, different surrogacy relationships necessitate a different ways of thinking through the problems that can arise.
Great question, Keith. Thank you for that. That's it gets at the way, Grace, you've structured the book and carefully bracketed the conversation, as you've just told us here, and you detail that in the book. It reminds us that we're not a uniformity. Say, oh, we're all Americans here, or we're all Canadians here, or we're all Taiwanese Christians here. We're all Presbyterians here. No. Even in these apparent uniform groups, there are huge differences, and that's really becoming important in the conversation today. So framing the book the way you have, I think, helps us to understand the complexity of the world that we're in, and we're trying to navigate and find our feet. You might want to say something about that, because I think your principles, the 4 principles for wisdom in making these decisions, I think your moral wisdom, you talk about 4 sources. You address it in the first pages of the book, and you come back to it later again and highlight it. You tell us about.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So as a Christian ethicist or a Christian theologian, I am appealing to scripture. I'm appealing to the Christian tradition. I'm appealing to reason or secular sources of knowledge, and to experience. And so, some people will say, oh, this is the Wesleyan quadrilateral. The different traditions term these 4, and different traditions will arrange them differently. So just to give you like the 3rd grader version, like a Catholic in conformity with the magisterium will put scripture and tradition as co-equal, right? And a sola scriptura type of Christian will say, no, the Bible is supreme. So, for example. But of course, when I'm drawing upon Christian tradition, I'm especially, the adjective progressive, right? So I'm especially looking at mainline Protestant denominational resolutions, which is to say that I'm not starting my progressive argument or vision for surrogacy like I'm starting from a certain place. Dr. Patterson, her review had mentioned, that's right, Grace is starting from a certain place, meaning I'm not going to start from, is it okay to separate sex from reproduction, right? Because if you are a Catholic in conformity with the social teaching of the church, the answer is absolutely not, right? So there's nothing I write in the book that will convince that Catholic that what I'm doing is okay. I'm not starting from the premise that, oh, is it okay for 2 men or 2 women to become parents, right? Because if I start there, I'll never get to surrogacy. Then I have to talk about gender, I have to talk about sexuality, right? So that's the type of, I'm pulling from certain traditions of Christianity, not all of them. The experience thing is not just my personal experience, although I'm glad to hear both from Amy and John that you enjoyed those aspects and it gave validity to the arguments I'm making. But in answer to Chris's question, we have ethnographic and social scientific studies about surrogacy from the mid 1990s. So the point is, we don't just have to I wonder how surrogacy created families are. I wonder how surrogates fare. We don't have to wonder. We can literally look at the data. And it's not just in the US and Canada and Australia and the UK. It's also India, Israel, Thailand, Mexico, right? So we can draw upon that as Christians do for other, controversial topics. So yes, I do draw upon those four sources in the ways that I do. Human rights, professional medical societies' opinions, professional ethics opinions on this. I talk about the reproductive justice framework. It's something I introduce in the book. And I put it all together. And the other thing I'll add is that, so I was asked earlier, how and why did I write this book? Well, the how is tied to personal experience. The why is, I kept on being asked, encouraged to do so. But I also really did feel, I wish I had my book, when I was going through surrogacy, right? Because I really did make some mistakes. There are conversations that weren't clarified. There are, fuzzy areas. And I felt like if I had this kind of guidance, maybe some sticky parts wouldn't have been so tough, right? So there was also that personal, pastoral, practical dimension.
Yeah. Thank you for that. That's really great. I'm going to go to Christine, but I'm going to cue Amy here. If you have something you want to kick in on this, I'll come back to you after we talk to Christine. Christine, what's your question?
Hi. So I have a friend who is unable to have kids and she has one child through a surrogacy and like to have another child. And they have a limited number of embryos available. And would this be would your book be something really helpful for her and maybe helping her to find a new surrogate, or for her to give to a friend who's maybe concerned about being a surrogate or interested? What's the target audience of your book?
So thanks for that. So if people are not interested in Christianity at all, they might find portions of it just not at all interesting, right? Because I'm engaging church teaching either for and against some of the positions I hold. But I have written it in an accessible style. So you don't have to be a professional ethicist or an academic to understand. And I'm hoping that it will be helpful for anyone who's wondered about the ethics of collaborative reproduction and what are the things they should be thinking about wherever they are, either as a potential intended parent or as a potential surrogate or, a pastor or teacher or counselor, thinking about those issues. Now, in the case of your friend, Christine, hopefully she did a lot of soul searching the first time around, in that first relationship. So it could be the case that some of the things I'm asking people to think through, she already has, right? So
I don't know that it would so much be for her, but she's trying to find someone else. The person who did the surrogacy the first time has some health issues that means she wouldn't be eligible to do it again.
Yeah.
And that would also be kind of a big ask to do it twice.
Right. Although, it's interesting because in the literature, that is a not uncommon story.
I think the health issues are,
Yeah, sure.
eliminated her as a possibility.
Right. But for any first time surrogate, bracketing, those concerns to become a second, especially to complete that intended parent's family if they have extra embryos. One thing that a lot of people going through just the IVF, so let me start again. So for a straight couple, surrogacy is usually the last chance, right? In their mind, it's the last resort. It's just the last thing they want to do is to involve a third party. Now, for queer couples, surrogacy is commonly, if they can afford it, which gets into larger social justice and health distribution issues, it's commonly their first choice, and it carries none of the social stigma or shame of infertility, right? And it's usually a first choice over adoption because a number of courts are still, discriminatory against queer couples, but they can also be involved in the child's creation in a pre-birth, right? In a way that's not always common with adoption. Yeah. So Christine, I got a little off track, but to get back to your question, I I've written it for the general reader. It is a university press book, so there are extensive footnotes, but you don't have to read the footnotes, right? If you want to be someone who, to gloss over them.
Okay, well, I will. I thought I would just let her know about it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I know they're hopeful, and you're right. It wasn't their first choice. They would have preferred to carry. It would have to be IVF in their case, but that they tried that many times, and that didn't work.
I just dropped an opinion piece I wrote for MSNBC just a couple years ago after Pope Francis condemned surrogacy. So you could start there, and if you like what you read, you might consider, okay, maybe I'll check out the book from the library.
Yeah.
I have another friend who was a carrier and carried twins for her friend. And I was really surprised at the pushback that I heard from her and in conversations with others against surrogacy and IVF. It surprised me. I didn't know that existed.
I will say this. I don't have any shame whatsoever, zero, that I carried this child for my friends. But my friends, they absolutely do feel sheepish in some contexts. They feel like they must justify their decision. So I am actually quite familiar with the pushback. In many Christian circles, progressive, evangelical, mainline, it is assumed that adoption is the morally superior alternative for couples who cannot have children, but want them. That is just, and there are many historical and pastoral and, all sorts of good reasons for that default. I argue in the book, though, that these reasons aren't unassailable. And many of the reasons that people push to infertile couples, why aren't you adopting? In fact, you should be asking people like me, why didn't I adopt? Why did I have naturally conceived children when, according to my faith tradition, I could have contracepted each and every time I had intercourse to adopt, right? So I argue in the book, it's not a huge part, but I argue that, in fact, that society places an unfair responsibility to infertile couples to adopt, when in fact, the problem of parentless children, which is a concern that Dr. Patterson has rightfully raised, it's the responsibility of everyone. The UNICEF says that every child has a right to know their parents, and UNICEF understands it social, genetic, and gestational, right? And I absolutely believe this. And I think it's a shared responsibility that we all have, not just for those who cannot naturally conceive and carry a child to term.
I want to just say, I think in some church environments, there's a shame put on women who can't have kids or who
Yes,
choose not to have kids.
yes,
All around.
yes.
So, Grace, I thought this. Thanks, Christine. It's just excellent conversation because it's bringing out some really key things that the book brings out, but key issues for us. And I think one of the ones you're touching on right now is that we look back. That where does this shame come from?
Mhm.
Is it a contemporary social thing? Has it come up in the last few hundred years? Is this a way we read Scripture? Do we read back? And I think you were helpful in pointing to a number of stories and cases where Scripture can inform us, but it can also impede how we think. I'm mindful of someone who basically says, "Oh, you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't do anything unnatural." And those of us
Mhm.
who are looking across, well, then let's stop doing all science because it's all unnatural, right? I just, it really nothing that you could do. And those are the kind of things that commonly come up, and they're sort of common sense arguments. And we need more of these kinds of conversations. And so, Amy, I was going to bring you in on this because Grace has among her 7 guiding principles. She has trust women in there, and I'm thinking about the trust factor because it's trust, and it's trust women in particular. I wanted to ask you uh, about this particular topic, but I'm also mindful about the end of life and where trust comes in. So maybe you can comment on that, uh, that phrase and that principle.
Oh, I mean, anyone who thinks that women should have autonomy in society should trust women. I think it's just I am shocked and not living in the US every day seems to be a fight against women and women's freedom. So that is a shocking thing for me. What I actually do want to talk about though,
Mm.
is is um, is the economy and economic justice. And Grace, you speak really well to the idea of the dangers of the commercialization of surrogacy. You talk about the fact that fertility treatments can be prohibitively expensive for some, and how additional subsidies should be provided, and so on. And I think that's all legitimate. My question is that when ART becomes unaffordable, I want to ask the question why. I know that the Lancet, for instance, put out an article last 2023 or 24, saying that we all know that fertility, ART, that kind of thing, is growing because we're having children later in life. You did, I did, and so more people are using it. But the cost is not going down, and that the industry itself in 2023 was worth like $35 billion in profit, and we're getting private equity investing in this.
Mhm.
So my question is, if we're talking about protecting vulnerable people and standing in solidarity with them, what do we do about the greater economic injustice that's happening with fertility?
Yeah, um, so I'm going to focus on the we. And so the we question is we have to work out what kind of good is having intact fertility.
Right.
So for instance, if we compare the US or Canada to Israel, Israel is absolutely a pronatalist state. And you can basically have infertility free, IVF treatments free of charge up until like the age of 50. And then at that point, the woman has to use an egg, not her own, right? And surrogacy is absolutely state subsidized. Now, why has Israel made those decisions? Well, because they have very particular reasons for wanting to perpetuate the Israeli nation, right? The U.S. is not going to go that way. I don't think Canada is, but we still have to ask the larger question: what kind of good is, the right to become a parent or the right to have a family? So from a human rights standard, the clause is the right to marry and found a family. And so then we can ask philosophically and from a rights-based thing, is that a negative or is that a positive right? Meaning, is my right to marry simply that no one can prevent me from falling in love with someone and marrying that person? And conversely with the right to found a family? Or does it actually require positive assistance? So now if I'm someone, infertility is tricky because, as you know, it's the one health diagnosis that requires two people. There's female factors, there's male factor, but you actually need two people to have a diagnosis. Does infertility, is that the type of thing that the state should positively assist you to overcome? And this gets into your economic questions. I don't know what the Canadian situation is, but in the US, multiple states have taken the position that they must positively help people overcome their infertility. And there are some private insurers who've also taken that position. So Starbucks, for instance, will give adoption assistance and infertility assistance in terms of IVF, gamete donation, and even surrogacy. So the economic question can't be answered until we first figure out what kind of rights we're talking about and if they're positive or negative. And then we can figure out other questions of distribution.
Thanks, Grace. Thanks, Amy. That opens up a whole series of questions.
Yeah.
And it's also spawned two raised hands. So we're going to pick up because we are coming up on an hour. And but I'm going to get Joseph in and Chris after. Joseph, you could unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, this is not exactly infertility, but have you considered the Old Testament custom of really a law of levirate marriage? It deals with the right to have children. If your husband dies, then it's the duty of his brothers to bear a child by you.
Yeah, I reference the fact that biblical stories of surrogacy are actually cautionary tales, that these are not exemplary models, whether we're talking about Hagar or we're talking about Jacob's co-wives or we're talking about the practice of levirate marriage. So yeah, back to John's question about the Bible, there's a long-standing link between fertility and righteousness and infertility and divine punishment or curse. So, you wonder where the shame comes from. Well, you have these biblical traditions that are putting these two. And levirate marriage, so I'm not passing judgment on cultures and communities that might still practice some form of that. But I would say from a progressive Christian viewpoint today, I would not... I don't think it should be somebody's obligation to carry the next generation, for their sibling, right? If they have issues about the what's the word, not having a male heir.
Thanks, Grace. Chris? Good question, Joseph. Thanks for that. Chris?
Yeah. Joseph's question actually segues nicely into mine, so thank you, Joseph. But my question takes us out of our specific topic for today. I live in Montreal, which is our part of Canada is a highly secular, in fact, anti-religious environment. So being a Christian thinker, ethicist, philosopher, whatever. My PhD is philosophy. Is an environment is not a trusted voice.
Mhm.
In the States, there are classically progressive state, but of course there are also conservative voices in in your world. What I'm leading to is, what does it mean for you to be a Christian ethicist in our time, where progressives don't necessarily view Christianity well, and conservative Christianity doesn't necessarily view your perspectives well. So what does it mean to be a Christian ethicist for you?
Yeah, well, it means that I speak out of particular traditions with particular worldviews, and I was formed and shaped, and I have certain baseline assumptions, that are irrevocable. Um, it doesn't mean that, so I had mentioned before that there's a long story that needs to be told about how you relate Christian conviction with public policy when you're living and operating in a pluralistic society. But it means that I'm not claiming a view from nowhere. At the very beginning of this, John asked about my background. I mean, I'm also second generation Taiwanese American. So even I'm not just claiming the Christian mantle, but a particular sets of commitments and traditions and values that have been passed down to me, some of them which I've preserved and some that I haven't. But I want to address one part of what you said in a slightly different direction. What's really interesting about surrogacy is that surrogacy is like pornography and it's like sex work, meaning there is a segment of the secular, in some cases atheistic, not always, but secular humanistic left that is absolutely aligned with the conservative right. So if we're talking about surrogacy, right? So in the same way that Catholic priests are saying this is an abomination, well, you also have, most of Europe is trending in the direction of abolishing surrogacy as opposed to allowing for it. And that's not due to Christian conviction at all, right? So I think that's really so similar to pornography or sex work. In many cases, you have these strange bedfellows, if you will, between, let's say, again, secular left and religious right is a complicated term, but more conservative elements of the Christian tradition. So I don't exactly know how it works in the Montreal context, but I would imagine with surrogacy, you're going to see some really interesting alliances, right? With segments that might disagree on other things. If I could say one more thing, drawing back to John's question to Amy about trusting women. So for me, I do think it's really interesting that abortion remains hotly contested, but when you poll Americans, most still say they want the right to terminate. Okay. And when you look at mainline Protestant denominations, they will say, yes, we affirm the conscientious right and good for, in consultation, for women to terminate or continue. Which is to say, there is consensus on a woman to continue or terminate a pregnancy for herself. But there is not among the American public or these mainline Protestant denominations, there is not consensus on the right and good for a woman to decide to undertake a pregnancy for someone else, meaning they trust her in her own pregnancy, but they don't trust her for another. They automatically put, oh, you're being exploited, you're poor, you don't know what you're doing, and I think that asymmetrical response is problematic. It shows why are you willing to trust a woman's reproductive decision in one context, but not another?
Chris, thank you for that question. That was great. And Grace, that response is excellent. It it takes us to where I think I want to conclude. This is a conversation that has been going on in the ASA. It's the type of conversations that we have and we need to have, because what you're pointing out is there's not uniformity here,
Mhm.
and there's a lot of misunderstanding, and they're complex issues. And they're coming at us, as we often say, like a freight train, and trying to learn about them. As one person said, it's like trying to drink from a fire hose. There's a lot of refreshing water there, but you're probably not going to get very much of it. This stream of information is just overwhelming us. And I draw our attention back in the ASA back in 2019. We were met in the Chicago area, and we had a fellows dinner at which we talked about uterine transplants.
Mhm.
And we had a Christian, a Jewish, and a Muslim scholar there to talk about that in conversation. And I'm reminded as I'm reading your book, and we're having this call today, is that these are challenging technical issues, but this is just one suite of what is happening to us as humans. What is the nature of a human? It's just not just the nature. We're not just men or women. We're humans in all of this, and the kind of medicalization, the technical, the economics concerns for that, and it's the front end of life. It's the back end of life. It's in the middle. It's as we go to school, as we age, at every facet. And this is why your calls for wisdom here, I think, are essential. We need to call ourselves and fellow Christians into prayer, into conversation, as we've done today. I just want to thank you for that. And in closing, then, I'm going to just announce what we're doing next. So next month, we're going to pick up another, what I think is another stimulating conversation, very different from this one. We're going to turn in again from perspectives to a hope-filled discussion of our relationship with the rest of creation. So our relation as humans to the rest of creation. Our guests will be Abigail Tamkin and David Buczynski to talk about their article, The Imago Dei, A Bridge to Faith-Infused Reconciliation Ecology. And I think this is a very vital conversation for us, and an entirely different aspect of our humanity and our giftedness and our call. So join us in November, in our next Diving Deeper session, as Abigail and David come together with us. And once again, Amy, Grace, thank you so much for the conversation today. Have a great weekend.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
everyone. Thanks
It's
for
been a
the
pleasure.
invitation to be here.